Thank you. We will now move on to the next item of business, and the next item of business is a debate on motion 16532 in the name of Angela Constance on independent review of sentencing and penal policy. And I call on Cabinet Secretary Angela Constance to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have updated Parliament on a number of occasions since October 2023 about the rise in prison population, the challenges this brings and what this government is doing about it. I have been clear on the need for ongoing action to continue to reduce crime and ensure that we have a sustainable prison population, and it is vital that our prisons can operate safely and effectively with public safety and the rehabilitation of prisoners at its very core. Despite recorded crime being down to 39% since 2006-07, the prison population has increased by 60% since 1990. Between 2011-12 and 2017-18, the population reduced by 9%, driven by a reduction in the number of young people sent to prison, before seeing it rise again in 2019-20. And between March and June 2020, we saw a temporary drop as a result of the pandemic, but the prison population has continued to rise thereafter. The harms caused by such a high prison population should not be underestimated. His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons for Scotland regularly describes the 9 evils of overcrowding, and I won't rehearse them all, but I will highlight a few. Those who work in prisons have less time to devote to screening prisoners for the risk of self-harm or suicide. Resources in prison are stretched, so prisoners have less access to programmes, education, training and work, and prisoners spend more time in their cells, and family contact and visits are restricted. We all want people leaving prison to successfully reintegrate into their communities, to contribute to society and be less likely to reoffend. And the harms associated with having a high prison population reduce the impact prison can make to prevent reoffending. So let me be clear, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is not changing its position on the use of prisons. Prisons will always be necessary for those who pose a risk of harm or threaten the delivery of justice. And our independent courts must continue to have the ability to remove an individual's liberty when that's appropriate. And protecting victims and the public from harm, as always, will be my absolute priority. Presiding Officer, we need to reconsider the kind of justice system that we want to have. I have said repeatedly that there needs to be a shift in the balance from custody to justice in the community. Debate around community-based sentences is often hostile and misinformed. We need to ask ourselves difficult questions about how to further tackle public health problems such as addiction, poor mental health and poverty that lead to higher rates of offending, with more effective community-based action. Do we truly believe as a country that the only solution is to build more and more prisons with significant economic and social cost? We need to face up to the reality of how counterproductive short prison sentences are, with profound and negative effects. Prison can... yes, of course.
Jamie Green.
Sorry to preempt what may come next, but there really is a presumption against short sentences in Scotland. I think the Cabinet Secretary is dancing around the head of a pin on this issue. What I and the public want to know is what crimes that our people are currently incarcerated for does the Government believe in future they should not be?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there is indeed a presumption against short-term sentencing in Scotland. That was very decisive action that this government took. However, I know that that has had a success in that the proportion of sentences that are short-term has reduced by 10 percentage points. But there is still a high use of short-term sentences in this country, and it's therefore beholden to me not to act as judge or jury, but it is beholden on me to do everything I can, and I am, and will continue to do so with investment to continue the increase that we are seeing in community payback orders. Because ultimately, I believe in accountability and I believe in reparation as much as I believe in rehabilitation. We know, Presiding Officer, that prison can, by its very nature, disrupt the factors that can help prevent offending. Imprisonment can have damaging effects through the breakdown of family relationships, cause housing instability and homelessness, negatively impact on employability and lead to job losses and weaken other societal ties and support networks. So I urge the Chamber to be willing to think differently, progressively, and acknowledge the clear benefits to our society of community-based sentences. The evidence tells us that these are more effective than short prison sentences at addressing underlying causes of offending behaviour and ultimately breaking the cycle of re-offending. Yet so often these are referred to as soft justice, and there needs to be a shift in the mindsets in all of us in this chamber that prison is the only effective punishment for those who commit offences. Presiding Officer, last year I indicated that I would establish an independent review of sentencing and penal policy. I can inform Parliament today that we have now established the group to conduct this review. And I am pleased to announce that Martin Evans, the former chair of the Scottish Police Authority, has agreed to be the chair of the review. In addition to his work at the SPA, he has a wide-ranging experience in the voluntary and public sectors and has chaired successful commissions and inquiries across the UK and Ireland. And he will bring the same level of dedication, professionalism and expertise to this review as he has done to his past work. And Mr Evans will be ably supported in this by 5 members of the Commission who collectively bring a great deal of expertise and experience to the table. And they are Catherine Dyer, CBE, Chair of Community Justice Scotland, Dr Hannah Graham, Senior Lecturer in Criminology at the University of Stirling, former Labour Justice Minister between 2003-2007, Cathy Jimison, Sheriff David Mackey and Lindsay Smith, Chair of Social Work Scotland Justice Standing Committee. And I'm very grateful to them all for taking on this significant and vital task. The review will consider how imprisonment and community-based interventions are currently used and how changes to this might contribute to our having a sustainable prison population. I have asked the Commission to initially focus on community sentencing, bail and remand and release from custody, and have also asked them to provide detailed and actionable recommendations for improvements by the end of this year with an interim report in autumn. In carrying out its work, the Commission will engage with stakeholders, victims and those with the experience of the justice system on how best to respect and protect the interests of victims while maintaining the rights of those accused of crime. Presiding Officer, it is clear to me that there is scope for the review to set out a transformative approach to sentencing and penal policy, and I ask that those across the Chamber engage with and support this process. As we all know, Scotland has one of the highest uses of custody in Western Europe, but there is nothing intrinsic about our country that means that it should not and could not have a penal policy which stops us being an outlier. Whilst we cannot import our solutions wholesale from elsewhere, we can learn from what other countries have done differently to reverse the trend of a growing prison population. Countries such as Sweden, Finland and the Netherlands have made long-term investments in non-custodial options. Finland introduced tighter regulations on the available sentence range. More individuals have been kept out of prison entirely through alternatives like suspended sentences, electronic monitoring or fines in countries including Germany and the Netherlands, while Sweden and a number of US states are focusing on rehabilitation, drug treatment and housing support. And international evidence tells us a whole systems approach is required, not just the criminal justice agencies, but also health and welfare partners. And to do this, we need strong political support and cross-party consensus, building on a shared recognition of the challenges and the commitment to solutions. Presiding Officer, we have taken many steps to ensure that we have a sustainable prison population and will continue to do so. The Scottish Prison Service has taken steps to optimise the use of home detention curfew. We took the difficult but necessary step of emergency early release. The Prisoners Early Release Scotland Act 2025 came into force last week and brings a new release point for most prisoners serving short-term sentences of under 4 years. And in 2024-25, we increased further the funding for community justice by 14 million to 148 million in total. And I would also like to take this opportunity to confirm to Parliament that the new bail test and the Bail and Release from Custody Scotland Act will come into force on the 14th of May 2025. The reforms to the bail law recognise the negative impact of short periods of imprisonment, while ensuring public and victim safety are at the heart of the court's decision-making. Presiding Officer, this Government has shown a clear commitment to strengthening alternatives to custody and ensuring imprisonment is only used when appropriate, taking decisive action such as the introduction of electronic monitoring for bail and community payback orders, presumption against short prison sentences and removing all our children from prisons. However, significant and sustained progress in this area isn't readily or easily achieved. It involves balancing urgent responses with long-term societal and cultural change, whilst respecting the operational independence of our justice partners. And it is clear to me that this is the time for us to be bold as a society and rethink our attitude to how we deliver justice and reduce offending. We have the opportunity to think differently, strategically and over the long term about how we achieve what we are ultimately the goals of everyone in this chamber: less crime, fewer victims and safer communities. And I move the motion in my name, Convener.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Liam Kerr to speak to and to move Amendment 16532.1. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Conservatives have been demanding a review of sentencing and penal policy for years, and I'm pleased to hear that progress has finally been made today, which I'm sure we will look forward to contributing to positively. But the Cabinet Secretary actually announced almost a year ago to the day that she, quote, plans to commence an externally led review of sentencing and penal policy. Yet rather than get going with the urgency required, we've seen instead a series of panic-stricken, knee-jerk reactions to the crisis of the prison population in the meantime, responsibility for which lies entirely at the feet of 18 years of SNP government, which has been in charge of Scotland's justice system. 18 years without developing a holistic, coherent strategy to understand why the prison population is so high and propose whole systems approaches to address it. 18 years of bringing forward, admittedly, extremely important legislation to address appalling crimes like historic sexual offences and domestic violence, but failing to adequately prepare for and provision the wholly predictable resultant increase in prisoners. And 18 years of failure to replace and/or increase capacity in an antiquated prison estate, which is consequently incapable of providing the rehabilitation opportunities required to break the cycle of reoffending that the Cabinet Secretary rightly talked of. Yes, I will.
Rona Mackay.
Thank you for taking the member for taking an intervention. Would the member recognise that, England and Wales are going through exactly the same situation that we are, and have encountered exactly the same problem, and have taken steps to do that?
Liam Kerr.
Well, my starting point is always to consider bespoke Scottish solutions to Scottish challenges. And I think it's very important to, where we have a fully devolved matter, where there are different systems, not to blindly mirror solutions in other legislations. Presiding Officer, that is why I propose the amendment I do today, which I hereby move, because the time for the warm words that we see in the government motion is long past. You see, if we are going to have a sentencing review, that has to start with levelling with the people of Scotland. It's actually quite difficult to be sent to prison these days. In 22-23, just 13% of convictions for a crime resulted in prison. And that's hardly surprising when you consider this government introduced in 2022 an instruction that criminals under 25 will not get prison unless no other sentence is appropriate. And any prison sentence for them will be shorter than where it's an older person that committed it. And the result was a 31% reduction in the number of under-25s being given custodial sentences, including a teenager who left a fire officer with life-changing injuries but got a CPO. If it hadn't been for the sentencing guidelines, quote, the court would have imposed a significant custodial sentence. And of course, in 2019, the government introduced a statutory presumption that a court must not pass a sentence of imprisonment for a term of 12 months or less. And if a criminal gets a sentence of 4 years or less, that used to mean automatic release at the halfway point, without restriction, without supervision, without consideration of the crime or the victim, whether rehabilitated or not. Now, of course, I used the past tense there because just this week that changed to less than half the sentence. And I thought it instructive when Lynn Burns, who is the victim's expert on the Scottish Sentencing Council and whose son Sam was murdered in 2013, said on Tuesday that 40% of a sentence is insufficient time to rehabilitate. And what's even more concerning in what has hitherto been an unevidenced knee-jerk policy, as the Cabinet Secretary admitted on Tuesday, the government doesn't even know how many of those released are violent offenders. And actually, the Cabinet Secretary's Tuesday interview was instructive, because she said the raison d'etre of this legislation is that we need to achieve a sustained reduction in the prison population. I would have thought the safety of the people of Scotland should be the overriding objective. And it's no wonder that a furious Linda MacDonald, survivor of a brutal attack by Dundee murderer Robbie McIntosh, is in today's Courier saying she worries about public safety and that there will be more victims. Indeed, Kate Wallace, the Victim Support Scotland, is surely right when she says resources are taking priority over victims and public safety. Certainly sounds like it, when only 2% of victims of prisoners released early by the SNP last summer were informed, and nothing substantive has been changed to the victim notification scheme since then. And I think, Presiding Officer, that's the real issue here. The motion does have warm words, but we've heard it all before. And it's never before been backed by plans, resources or holistic thinking. And I think that's why the reconviction rate rose in 2020 to 21, as significantly did CPO reconvictions. Yes, I will.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I appreciate very much that Mr Kerr wishes to campaign for changes in the victim notification scheme. I think I will be certainly with him on at least part of that journey, depending on what his proposals are. But in terms of the need to reduce the prison population, I wonder if he has any specific proposals that he would like to outline what he is for as well as against.
Mr Liam Kerr.
Yeah, I think that's a fair challenge. And actually, what we would have done is obviously building capacity such that the new Barlinnie isn't 10 times over budget. It costed nearly £1 billion and is going to be delayed again. So we'd have ensured that wouldn't happen. But I actually agree with the Cabinet Secretary on many things. There has to be a holistic strategy, a holistic policy looking at the whole environment to ensure that the right people are going to prison, the public safety is protected, but those who shouldn't be in prison shouldn't be there. And so I absolutely think that in terms of the new group that she's put together, if that's what they're looking at, I'm absolutely with her on that, and I look forward to contributing to it. Because in summer, to finish my point, Presiding Officer, we had 477 prisoners released early, but 1 in 8 reoffended within weeks. And this is the thing, this is why we need, and what we should have had previously, action, resources and evidence-based policy making, not warm words. And the reason I want to finish on this, Presiding Officer, is that 6 years ago, I brought a motion to this Parliament. It was a simple one-sentence demand that urgent action must be taken to restore public trust in the justice system, including the abolition of automatic early release. The then Justice Secretary, the never knowingly effective and now rarely seen Humza Yousaf, amended to have a go at the UK government. But in an unusual and unexpected dalliance with sound policy making, his amendment said, future reforms to sentencing policy should be informed by evidence of what works, to reduce reoffending and take appropriate account of Scotland's current internationally high rate of imprisonment. Lamentably, it seems it's taken 6 years for the government to get to that point, whilst instead making panic-stricken, unevidenced, knee-jerk responses like early release of criminals. Presiding Officer, I suspect the Cabinet Secretary will agree with me on this. The time for warm words is over. The time for proper evidence-based policy making with proper resources and honesty in sentencing is now. And for those reasons, I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Kerr. Could I remind those members who wish to speak in the debate to please check that they, in fact, have pressed the request to speak buttons? And could I call on Polly McNeill to speak to and to move Amendment 16532.2? Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move the amendment in my name. Our prisons are bursting at the seams and we are now forced to release prisoners early, causing deep public concern. And we have some of the highest levels of incarceration in Europe, so it's clear that one of the answers to this situation is a focus on sentencing. To do that, it's obvious that we have to give the courts serious alternatives to imprisonment. In fact, I don't know how many times it's been said in this chamber. But it is a failure of SNP justice management that we have not made progress in this area. We've arrived at the point where the number of community payback orders has in fact slumped over the last decade. In 2014-2015, there were over 19,000 community payback orders, but nearly 10 years later, this figure is just over 15,000. So it seems extraordinary that that's the case, that we're going backwards, to me. If we want to send less people to prison where appropriate and relieve our bulging prison estate, then it's also important that we run our prisons better within. And the importance of being able to work with offenders has been rehearsed many times. It's the work you do with them, it's the conditions they are in prison, and to give the staff an opportunity to do the job that they were employed to do inside the prison. But research suggests that community sentencing can have a positive effect on both the reoffending chances of the perpetrator and the public purse. But what is crucial in those cases is that it makes sense to do so and that it has the confidence of the public and the judiciary. We all know that. It's not an easy fix. It does require a serious focus to make it work. And to that extent, I do agree with the Cabinet Secretary and give her the assurance that Scottish Labour do think that it's a matter in which there should be cross-party working. Well, one of the reasons that community payback orders are not as used as much as they should be, I've heard this many times, is that judges don't seem to have the confidence in some of the programmes or the ability for the convicted person to complete them. So we need to improve the suitability of community payback orders, particularly those with addictions, those who lead chaotic lives. And the Justice Committee heard this fairly recently. When Karen McCluskey, the Chief Executive of Community Justice, pointed out, we must imprison those whom we are afraid of, and not just those that we're mad at. She says people enter our justice system with mental health issues, addiction problems, homelessness, the care system, and many who are victimised as children. But for those who receive a jail term, we do need to improve access to through care services. And these services involve meeting people who are coming out of prison and trying to get them back into their homes and communities, which many of the third sector organisations are brilliant at doing, such as the WISE Group. So we know all this. But the budget is around £5 million, and it has been estimated that if we are actually to provide through care for everyone who's coming out of prison, then it would cost near £19 million. And given the majority of sentences are short-term sentences, with many people with addiction issues who cycle through the system time and again, it's a bit of a false economy not to invest more in these systems. I've had many letters, in fact, from constituents who have written to me from prison, who are frustrated that they can't get on the courses that they are willing to go on to demonstrate that they have been rehabilitated. I confess that I don't have the data, but it's somewhat anecdotal. But it does suggest to me that there are long waiting lists inside prison for rehabilitation, and that people who want to go on courses, and also the waiting list itself, you could be waiting in the list and someone else could go above you. So it just seems a bit unfortunate that inside the prison where we're trying to do this kind of work, and it would be helpful to get more data on that. But at the moment, the Scottish Labour position is we're not in favour of review of sentencing policy, and it's the first time I've heard the Cabinet Secretary's intentions, and I'll reconsider that, but this is our position at the moment. I'm happy to take.
Liam Kerr.
Just on the piece about through care that the member was just talking about, does it concern the member then that there's no specific budget line in next year's budget for through care?
Well, this is what dumbfounds me at times, that to take part in this debate for 2 decades, so We know, I have actually, we know that the answers lie in through care, supporting prisoners, but yet we're nowhere near that. So a budget line to demonstrate the government's commitment to this, I think, would definitely be appropriate in that sense. I agree. I just want to set out why, I will in a minute, why we are not convinced by this policy review. I'll take an intervention from the Cabinet
Secretary.
Thank you. I just wondered if Ms McNeill welcomed the fact that the new Through Care contract has been agreed and it will be enforced for the next financial year with increased investment now reaching £5.3 million.
Pauline McNeill.
Well, I absolutely will, but the 2 points are not mutually exclusive. I would like to see it visibly, but yes, of course, I do welcome the commitment here. To me, what I'm demonstrating here is that a lot of the answers to these problems are already known. There was confusion over the sentencing policy of under-25s, partly because the Sentencing Council, in my opinion, didn't seem to take any soundings from Parliament before they arrived at their policy. But there hasn't been a lot of real discussion in the Parliament about that policy. There's lengthy guidance, as Liam Kerr's already said, and it has been quite controversial. And there is a case for the Criminal Justice Committee to look at sentencing as well. And this is a point I'd like to make to the Cabinet Secretary. There must be some transparency around this important debate. And one of my concerns about another review on sentencing is that it will put it behind closed doors. And this Parliament needs more transparency in the discussion. I also don't fully understand what approach the Crown are taking, for example, who seem to be using their discretion more often not to take young offenders to court. I'm not commenting on the rights and wrongs of that. I just feel that there should be more upfront openness about what's happening here. Because if the government want cross-party support for this, then I think it follows that we need to know exactly where you're heading and to discuss with us what the alternatives will be. So we believe that the job of the government is to get on with doing this and not to kick it into the long grass with a review. Presiding Officer, I'll close with, we've debated many times that 2,000 people on remand in Scotland, and there is a problem here that needs to be discussed because we need answers to the dealing with remand prisoners in overcrowded jails where there are no programmes for obvious reasons. We need to think more about the conditions we're holding remand prisoners in. Those on remand suffer some of the same issues as convicted prisoners, and the WISE Group tell me that one of the things about losing your home and your job and taking off the GP register, and I'll finish on this point, I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary is aware of this, but you're removed from your GP register when you go to prison, and it seems to be the case even on remand. And one of the small changes that could be made is not to do this. I mean, the Justice Committee successfully argued some of the points around prescriptions within the system to make that more joined up. But there's small things that can be done to make a difference to prisoners, and that's one that I think the government should look at. So, moving amendment in my name. I will listen carefully to what the government have to say, but at the moment our position is that let's get on with the job. We know what the answers lie. You'll get our full cooperation, but we don't want to see this happen behind closed doors. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. And I now call on Maggie Chapman to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the information that the Cabinet Secretary has shared with us this afternoon about the Commission that's to be chaired by Martin Evans, and I look forward to receiving regular updates on the work of that body. Research published in the Lancet Medical Journal this month puts this debate into context. Over 11.5 million people are incarcerated across the world, and that number is rising. It increased by around 1/3 from 2023 to 24 alone. At least 1 in 7 of those people has a severe mental illness, as well as the very many who are in poor physical health. Behind those figures lie two stark realities. The first is that whether someone is incarcerated or not depends not so much on the harm they have caused, but on who they are, what their childhood was like, where they live, what illnesses they live with. Between half and 3/4 of people charged in court have mental illness, compared to around 1/5 of the general population. The second is that for most people, prison makes their mental health worse. Prison is not a safe place, and it does not make the world outside prison safer either. Not for survivors of violence, not for wider communities, and not for people who have been incarcerated, who are in serious risk of avoidable death in their very first week after release. Scotland is a part of this problem, and as the motion highlights, this motion also reflects most of us want to be part of the answer. Against a backdrop of brutality from Washington, and tragically from Westminster too, Scotland wants to be different, and we in the Scottish Greens are ready to work for that difference to happen. That means a radical ethics of care and compassion. It means a recognition that genuine security is about well-being rather than control. It means giving restorative and community justice a chance to work, and giving survivors well-founded confidence that non-custodial sentences, properly implemented, will keep them safe. It means giving individual attention to people who need support, in primary prevention, in the community and in prison. It means managing cases swiftly and efficiently, making the necessary connections between civil and criminal cases. It means legal aid that works for all those who need it, including in relation to child contact. And it means recognising and rewarding the difficult and vital work of all those in the justice sector, including the invaluable expertise of the third sector, the forensic specialists at Dundee University's Leverhulme Research Centre, which senior management shockingly plan to close. It means including our increasingly overstretched prison officers and the staff whose pressures were described so vividly in the PCS Union's recent Rough Justice report. I don't underestimate how difficult any of this is, but this is why this independent review is needed, to find out exactly what is happening, why so many people are still being sent to prison, what needs to change and how it can happen. But it needs more as well. It needs resources of funding, of course, but also of political and public will. We know that poverty and adverse childhood experiences make people vulnerable and to involvement in crime, as victims and survivors, and as those convicted. And yet we still see traumatised children described in utterly dehumanising language by irresponsible media and political figures. I hope that this afternoon's debate will be free of that kind of contempt. I hope that we can find consensus on positive ways to move forward, to make Scotland a safer, more just and a more compassionate place. And I look forward to hearing and speaking later about some of those transformational pieces of work that are already happen, need support and must continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. And I call on Liam MacArthur to open on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too welcome the debate and indeed the independent sentencing review. I know it's dangerous to prejudge such things, but I confidently expect such a review to confirm the blunt reality that our justice system is too reliant on prison. My confidence is reinforced by the fact that Part 1 of the UK sentencing review published earlier this week came to that very conclusion. That review, of course, is being headed up by former Conservative Justice Secretary David Gauke, who was withering in his criticism of what he describes as the penal populism of some politicians. Now, I've got far too much respect for Liam Kerr, and he knows that, to accuse him of such. But the repeated mantra of some in his party about soft-touch justice in a country with the highest prison population in Western Europe seems to fit Mr Gauke's description rather well. While some of the criticisms in the Tory amendment are entirely valid, the apparent desire to lock up even more of our population is not. And I would urge Liam Kerr to follow the advice of his former colleague David Gauke. After all, it does appear to be common sense. Of course, prison is and will remain the best and only option for those who pose a danger to society. Even then, however, public safety demands that every effort is made to rehabilitate as well as to punish. But in many, many instances, we know that prison sentences are an ineffective deterrent and increase the likelihood of reoffending. If our number one priority really is to keep communities across Scotland safe, and it must be, we need to recognise that very often there are more effective tools for reducing crime than prison. Yes, these are decisions for an independent judiciary, but we as politicians have a role to play. partly in resisting the penal populism identified by David Gauck, but also in ensuring that the alternative options available to judges and sheriffs are properly resourced, robustly enforced and consistently available. That's not the case as present, as others have observed. And while this will certainly come at a cost, it is a cost that is dwarfed by that of building more and more prisons to lock up more and more people who will then be released to continue reoffending more and more often. I believe that sentencing and penal policy should reflect this reality and be guided by the evidence. And while it can't be the primary motivation, of course, this review needs to reflect the context of the dangerous overcrowding we see in our prisons. Dangerous for staff, for prisoners and ultimately for communities. For years, the government was warned about the developing crisis, yet action, I would argue, was slow and insufficient. It's certainly fair to argue that actions can take time to have an effect, but that argument becomes less persuasive over time. Even now, there seems to be a lack of urgency, as Liam Kerr, I think, fairly noted. The Cabinet Secretary first announced her intention to commission a review into sentencing exactly a year ago. In that time, Scotland's prison population has continued to balloon, and Parliament has been asked to sanction 2 separate emergency prisoner releases, while granting sweeping future powers to ministers. So while I welcome the review, believe it is necessary and certainly wish Martin Evans and his colleagues very well, I think Pauline McNeill is right to argue that it will require time to carry out its work and to come forward with its recommendations. That's time Scotland's prison population can ill afford. Scotland's prisons are at a tipping point. That was the very stark warning last year from Theresa Medhurst, Scottish Prison Service Chief Executive. She was right to highlight, as I said before, the consequent risks for staff, for prisoners and ultimately for communities. Scottish Liberal Democrats support efforts that will reduce the use of prison sentences in favour of alternatives that we know are more effective and keep our communities safe. But I can't help feeling that the time it has taken to get to this point suggests the government are still not fully facing up to the scale and the urgency of the action that is required. And that, presiding officer, is something that has to change.
Thank you, Mr MacArthur. We will now move to the open debate. I would advise that we have backbench speeches at the agreed speaking slot of up to 4 minutes and that we have no time in hand and therefore any interventions have to be absorbed within the agreed allocated time. I call Fulton McGregor to be followed by Jamie Green. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's debate examines the difficult issue of prison populations, the justice system in Scotland and ensuring that the Scottish public are safe from harm. In looking at the current environment, the issue of rising prison populations is causing issues for governments across the whole of the UK. Here in Scotland, the prison population often exceeded 8,300 last year, with projections indicating that these numbers will continue to rise, potentially to record numbers. It has been made clear to my colleagues and I at Justice Committee that these numbers are unsustainable without intervention. Further instability will put the effective functioning of our prison service at risk, including the ability, of course, to rehabilitate offenders. So it is of critical importance that we explore various range of actions to ensure that this system operates safely and effectively for staff and prisoners alike. The announcement of this independent review of sentencing and penal policy is a step towards ensuring that this risk does not become a reality. It might be inferred that higher prison populations indicate that Scotland is becoming more dangerous, but as we've heard, recorded crime continues to trend downward over the last 2 decades. There are numerous reasons for this increasing population, including increased sentencing lengths, more convictions for historical offences, and increasingly complex situations regarding separating groups of prisoners from one another, all issues that we hear regularly about in Justice Committee. In exploring this topic, we have previously heard evidence that those released from short custodial sentences are reconvicted at a rate of almost twice as often as those sentenced to a community payback order. It is with stats like these that we must recognise that, while appropriate in many cases, short prison sentences are often not the best way to reduce reoffending. So far, the Scottish Government has taken a range of actions to address the issue of rising prison populations, and these include extending the presumption against short-term sentences, introducing electronically monitored bail and enabling the time to be taken into account at sentencing, and strengthening alternatives to remand. These steps are mitigatory, so it is necessary that further in-depth research takes place on imprisonment and community-based sentences, and therefore, like I've said, I wholeheartedly welcome this externally led review of sentencing and penal policy. Like so many issues, addressing this topic will cost money. The Scottish Government has increased the justice allocation in the budget for the second year running. And if my cross-party colleagues support this budget, they will be supporting an investment of almost £4.2 billion in justice, which is an increase of nearly £400 million. So that's my call to the other parties to consider supporting the budget. I would say, though, and the Cabinet Secretary will not be surprised to hear this, and in fact she's mentioned it herself, that if we want to radically change the balance between community rehabilitation and custody, then we need to fund that balance. I do, of course, welcome the continued investment in criminal justice social work services, and obviously we can't change that balance overnight, but we would need to change it gradually over a set period of time, and therefore I think there should be increased investment on a year-on-year basis until that balance is achieved. 4 minutes and we've been asked to incorporate. Sorry, Mr Kerr. However, I am also fully aware that these increases of funding have been made while the impact of the Labour UK Government changes to employers' national insurance contribution could cost the justice portfolio millions unless the UK Government commits to a full funding of these potential shortfalls. These shortfalls won't only affect major public bodies, but also third sector partners in areas such as community justice and victim support. And I would call again on Labour colleagues in this Parliament to ask the UK Government to rethink this policy and approach. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, Scotland is facing a potential crisis with increasing prison populations. An independent review of sentencing and penal policy will be an invaluable resource for exploring ways that we can address this issue while ensuring that victims and the public at large across Scotland are protected from harm. Recent reviews in the rest of the UK have shown similar trends that require radical interventions, and this Scottish Government's increased justice allocation for the proposed budget underlines this SNP's Government's commitment to keeping Scotland safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr McGregor. I now call Jamie Green to be followed by Rona Mackay. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It wasn't long ago we debated the bail and release from custody bill. We argued in our part that we thought it would do very little to reduce the prison population. The Government, of course, argued very much to the contrary. They said that our burgeoning prison population was the very reason that we had to think about remand and release. They argued that extraordinary times called for extreme measures, we were told. And it would, of course it would be unpopular, perhaps, with the public, but we would just have to suck that up because we may see mass unrest and disorder in our prisons. Same again last year. We were asked to early release prisoners due to overcrowding, twice. And again, when the Government asked us to consider automatic early release at just 40% of the sentence served. But of course, all of that is against the backdrop of a system where we already have a presumption against short sentences of less than 2 years in Scotland. We already have a considerable rise in the number of non-custodial alternatives being handed out by judges. We have a considerable rise, actually 20% rise in electronic tagging of offenders, and of course sweeping changes to the sentencing criteria for under 25-year-olds, all of which the Government assured us would reduce our prison population. But of course what's actually happened is quite the opposite. In 2022, the prison population was just over 7,400. Last year, that was 7,850 on average, and just last week, it was hitting 8,300. We were hoodwinked into thinking that this ruse that somehow automatic early release and emergency early release would make for safer prisons, forgetting the fact that it might not make for safer streets, which surely should be the underpin of any policy around sentencing. What I think the Government is not willing to say, but is thinking, is that it thinks judges are sending too many people to prison. The Cabinet Secretary won't go on the record and say what crimes she thinks that currently people are sent to prison for in future would not be under any potential review. Now, I don't have a problem with review of the penal system or indeed sentencing, but I think what the public will expect is just some honesty from the Government on this and some honesty from this Parliament when understanding what would happen as a result of that. I have for many times stood in this chamber and recounted my thoughts as to why our prisons are full. The answers have been obvious and staring us in the face for 2 decades, as Pauline McNeill said. Our remand population is sitting at nearly 2,000 at the moment. That's a quarter of the prison population. If we sped up the backlog of court cases, many of these people would be processed and perhaps out of prison. You could reduce the prison population overnight if there was no remand population. That surely would address the issue of overcrowding. There are 23,000 cases in the system still waiting to see their day in court, some waiting up to 3 years to see their cases come down. That affects the victims and, of course, those accused as well. We've seen a huge surge in that backlog of serious crimes, including historic sexual crimes, serious organised criminal activity, and of course new legislation that we ourselves have passed. Now, here's the thing: the government cannot laud itself for clearing the backlog of court cases on one hand, but then lament the fact that the byproduct of that is that more people are going to prison. You can't have it both ways, Cabinet Secretary. The what of this motion and what of this review? Well, I have great respect for many of the individuals. I don't have time. I have much respect for many of the individuals that have been named on the panel, but I do fear, and I hope it is just a fear, that this new review panel will not simply just tell the government what it wants to hear as an outcome. It must be fully independent, and it must fully look at all options and consider particularly the voices of victims. Now, in the opening statement from the Cabinet Secretary, I don't think I heard the word victims once. I'll check the official report, but I hope that can be amended, because surely putting victims at the heart of any penal reform is what matters, putting victims first, and all the victims' organisations I've spoken to share that concern. I will end simply on this note. Whether we like it or not, the perception is that the balance of the system of justice in Scotland has moved towards those who have erred and have been convicted, not those who have been harmed. That may be a perception, it may be true, but we must fix that. We must put victims at the heart of any reform. Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Green. I now call Rona Mackay to be followed by Audrey Nicholl. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland is one of the highest prison populations in Western Europe. We're simply locking too many people up, and that cannot continue. And so I welcome the Scottish Government's action to establish a review of sentencing and penal policy to consider the most effective ways to address offending behaviour and lower the number of victims. And I'm also extremely pleased, as we've just heard, that it will be chaired by Martin Evans, former chair of the Scottish Police Authority, supported by 5 expert commissioners. The Commission will examine how imprisonment and community-based interventions are currently used in Scotland. Presiding Officer, we need to look at alternatives to custody, that is clear. This SNP Government's commitment to strengthening community justice services by investing £159 million in 2025 to 26 reaffirms that. Scotland is not alone in facing the challenge of prison overcrowding. The previous and current UK Government have taken action to respond to the rising prison population in similar ways. Interestingly, the recently published GOC review that Liam Mackay mentioned, the former Tory minister, it highlights an increased prison population in England and Wales despite a reducing crime rate. Unlike Scotland, the UK Government has embarked on the early release of prisoners where safe and appropriate to alleviate overcrowding. Presiding Officer, protecting victims and the public from harm is the absolute priority, and prison will always be necessary, and for some it is essential. But I do question whether prison is the best place for many who are sent there. As convener of the cross-party group on Women, Families and Justice, I'm aware just how damaging incarceration is to families and children, and often does nothing to rehabilitate the offender. We know that short prison sentences are often not the best way to reduce reoffending. Community-based interventions are more effective in reducing reoffending and assisting with rehabilitation, and ultimately leads to fewer victims and safer communities. Presiding Officer, there are far too many women in custody and on remand. In January this year, 330 women were incarcerated. Around 30% of them were on remand. Now, I agree with Jamie Green and Pauline's comments about remand, although I'm not sure how it would be possible to have no one on remand. But it's something that we do have to tackle. It's estimated that as many as 90% of women in custody in Scotland have addiction problems, whether alcohol or drugs, and it's further estimated that 80% of women in prison have brain damage due to head injuries caused by domestic violence, and a similar number of women suffer mental illness to some degree. Presiding Officer, prison is no place for these women whose addiction and chaotic life experience has led them down the wrong path. They need holistic help. No one chooses that as a lifestyle choice. Scotland's amazing third sector organisations do an incredible job helping people when they leave prison in a holistic, trauma-informed way. For many, particularly women, they are a lifeline and essential to getting them back on track. But sadly, often the damage to families and children has already been done. The new women's custody units in Glasgow and Dundee are a huge step in the right direction, designed to help women move slowly back into a normal routine. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I'm delighted that the Scottish Government are working with our justice partners to look at how we can offer alternatives to custody. We need to steer a better path and have confidence in alternative pathways. Prisons should be the exception, not the rule. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Mackay. I now call Audrey Nicholl to be followed by Ben McPherson. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Since this parliamentary session began, the challenges that the justice system faces have featured prominently in Chamber business. Justice touches absolutely everyone. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Back in 2022, the new Vision for Justice strategy set out the timely and welcome approach being taken across Scotland to grasp the nettle of reform in our justice system to one that meets the needs of a modern and contemporary Scotland. Scotland's prison population remains amongst the highest in Western Europe. Front and centre of virtually every debate this session has been reducing that population. We understand the factors behind the stubborn upward trend, many already referenced by members, the complexities of the prison population, longer sentencing, the relentless legacy of COVID. This is not unique to Scotland, but meaningful and sustained change has been difficult to achieve. Whilst I support modernisation of our prison estate, I strongly disagree that creating more prison space as part of the solution to the current prison population challenge fits remotely with a contemporary justice system. And in response, Scotland has, I won't if you don't mind, I'm short of time, thank you. In response, Scotland has undertaken a range of proactive steps, amongst them broadening out community justice, interventions, presumption against short-term prison sentences and enacting the Bail and Release from Custody Act to support more effective use of bail and more effective release planning. The provisions in the Children, Care and Justice Act that ensure under-18s are no longer sent to prison are also hugely welcome. And I entirely agree with the comments made by Rona Mackay with regard to community custody units that effectively aim to support women as they transition out of a prison environment back into the community. In terms of the forthcoming budget for 2025 to 26, I am pleased to see the Scottish Government commitment to strengthening community justice services through an investment of almost £160 million, and I urge all members to support the budget next week. We cannot call out perceived failures in the system on the one hand without supporting the solutions on the other. I note the comments of Dr Hannah Graham and her academic colleagues in their submission to the Criminal Justice Committee relating to the recent early release of prisoners. And they said this prison population and jail conditions are important issues which have been raised for decades. It will take political will, moral courage, resources and action on several fronts to achieve meaningful change. I therefore welcome the Cabinet Secretary's update on an independent review of sentencing and penal policy to examine how custodial sentences and community interventions can be used to best effect, importantly including if and how they can be developed further. And I'm also delighted to hear Martin Evans will chair the Commission, bringing a wealth of insight and experience to his role, as the other commissioners referenced today will too. And I don't think for one second that Martin Evans will tell the Cabinet Secretary what she wants to hear. I think the Cabinet Secretary updated that the review will initially focus on community sentencing, bail and release from custody. However, I hope that the issues around remand are also included as part of this early work, and perhaps the Cabinet Secretary can jog my memory as to whether this is included in her closing remarks. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I support all proposals to enable Scotland to continue on its journey towards a reformed and effective justice system. I welcome the announcement today and I look forward to following the progress of the review.
Thank you, Ms Nicholl. And I call Ben McPherson. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm also grateful to speak in this debate today on this important subject and welcome the establishment of the independent review. And as well as what others have said about the Chair and the other members, I'm particularly welcome to see the inclusion of Sheriff Mackey, who I've had the privilege of dealing with on a number of occasions, and pay tribute to the work he's done on these matters since retiring as a sheriff in terms of the prevention of crime.
I hope that the establishment of the review will mean that the people undertaking this work will have the full data available to them that is across the government and also more widely, and will be able to commission any data that they require, because to me that is such an important part of making sure that this is a success, and I know that prominent academics like Professor Leslie McCara would also emphasise that point. Of course, this review is happening because the current situation that we find ourselves in collectively is extremely challenging and difficult, with the high populations in our prisons exceeding 8,300 last year, and the need for action. And as part of that, I think that the commitment from the government to significant further investment in community justice in the budget that hopefully Parliament will pass on Tuesday is really important. I hope that this will be part of a continuing increase in that budget, because the evidence that we heard at the Criminal Justice Committee for increased investment in the criminal community justice part of the portfolio can only help us in the collective challenge of reducing reoffending and reducing instances of crime. Also, the third sector is referenced in the motion from the government, and I couldn't emphasise from my constituency experience how important their role is in this collective challenge, whether it's Fresh Start or Circle Scotland or Turning Point or others based in my constituency. The support that they provide both to those who are leaving prison and the families of those who are either in prison or leaving prison is so important in making sure that we tackle the challenge of reoffending and break the cycle, and make sure that we have that through care, which I know that the review will be looking at. One question I wanted to pose, and I'm sure it will be in the government's considerations and the reviews, is that of housing. The amount of casework I've had over the years of single men who have left prison coming to my constituency surgeries or writing to me about challenges that they are experiencing. Edinburgh's housing crisis is the most acute in Scotland, but we really need to think about just how we improve the housing offering for individuals in that situation, and make sure that that's part of their support. The other challenge, which of course is part of the immediate, but also about how we build a better situation in the future, is why are so many people ending up in prison and ending up in engaging in crime? And as part of the Christie Principles, which of course we collectively committed to 10 years ago, how do we, yes, mitigate the social and economic circumstances that have been referred to that contribute to a situation where individuals may engage in crime? But I also think that we have an issue still in Scotland with a culture of violence. And as I have raised in the Parliament in recent times, I'm particularly concerned about this with regard to our young people. So the more opportunities that there are for sport, third sector engagement, youth work, this will all make a difference in terms of reducing the population in prison in the future. There's a lot more that we could say on this topic, Presiding Officer, and I hope that we will have future debates where we'll have more time to talk about these very challenging and serious issues about the rule of law in our society, about prevention and rehabilitation.
Thank you, Ms McPherson. We will now move to closing speeches, and I call on Maggie Chapman to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I spoke in my opening speech about language, the language of contempt and the language of care. I've been encouraged that we haven't heard any of that language of contempt this afternoon. Indeed, despite the differences in the motions and amendments, there is quite a lot of agreement in the Chamber, including the recognition of the urgency for action to tackle our too high prison population. As Liam MacArthur pointed out, our justice system is too reliant on prison, and we know women too often are most affected by this. Yes, there's a new Washington consensus of cruelty towards migrants and refugees, towards transgender and non-binary people, towards the people of Palestine, whose genocide is now part of a grotesque real estate proposition, towards the present and future victims of climate injustice. But Westminster really doesn't have to follow every step quite so assiduously. And here in Holyrood, we certainly don't need to. Keir Starmer may have thrown out his human rights commitments with his pre-Downing Street spectacles, but we in the Scottish Greens are holding on to ours. part and essential foundational part of enabling a better society is creating a better justice system. That is one that doesn't scapegoat the powerless while enabling the crimes of the powerful, of corporations, of elites and law-breaking states. It's one that gives survivors real agency and genuine security. It's one that requires those who cause harm to take responsibility for their actions, to seek and find the help that they need, to use their own experiences to help others to change. Instead of the vicious circle of offence and re-offence, of intergenerational and community damage, we could have virtuous circles of infectious rehabilitation. But the slow violence of prison is the worst soil in which these seeds can grow. I'm encouraged by work happening in the North East, especially by third sector organisations who use their expertise and care to provide invaluable help to those already involved in the criminal justice system and also to those at risk of involvement. Those include TCA, working in Dundee and Angus with initiatives including the holistic Beyond Mentoring service for women in Dundee, bridging the gap between statutory support services and moving on. Positive Steps, also in Dundee, helps people leaving incarceration to access housing and services, recognising how vital the right support is, especially in those crucial first days and weeks post-release. Of course, much of the work carried out by third sector organisations and by statutory agencies is about mitigation of what other parts of the system are getting wrong, of the damage caused by incarceration and the failure to act on evidence of what works, both in terms of alternatives to custody and of earlier prevention and diversion, as we've just heard from Ben McPherson. So we welcome the independent review, which I hope will address the serious knowledge gaps in this area, including about why non-custodial sentences are not being used more. But I ask the Cabinet Secretary whether she could say a bit more about how third sector partners will be included and engaged in this review, because they really do so much of the heavy lifting. And it's for these reasons that we're not able to support Pauline McNeill's amendment, though we do agree with many of the points that she makes in it, particularly those about women in prison and the importance of through care services. The independent review must be robust and speedy, both in its reporting and, as appropriate, its implementation. But this must not be used as an excuse not to do the rest of the work that's needed too. The work that we already know about that can, with courage, will and resources, save lives, break cycles of trauma and help individuals, families and communities to live safer, healthier and fairer lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now call on Katie Clark to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, for giving me this opportunity to close this debate on behalf of Scottish Labour. We believe there is indeed a consensus across this Parliament on many of the issues that we are debating today, and indeed on the Criminal Justice Committee. And the real challenge that we have is why the consensus that exists and has existed, we believe, for many decades, has not been implemented in terms of how our courts deal with criminal behaviour. Ben McPherson quite rightly raised the issue of why we have high levels of crime in Scotland, particularly violent crime, and those are issues that this Parliament should be engaging with. But the debate today is more about how we deal with offending behaviour once it has happened. As the Cabinet Secretary has said, there has been a 60% increase in Scotland's prison population after 1990, which reduced slightly as a result of change in policy in relation to young offenders who were largely taken out of the criminal justice system, but has since increased. Scottish Labour does not accept that we have a sustainable prison population. We have the highest numbers of people in prison in Europe and also the highest numbers on remand, and we do not believe that this is sustainable. We know that there is little rehabilitation in prison. Prisoners do not have access to the programmes that they need that might ensure that they do not reoffend, that prison staff are under massive pressure, that many prisoners who are held on remand are either found not guilty or immediately released when found guilty at trial due to the length of time that they've already spent in custody, and that we have high levels of reoffending from people that go through the justice system. As Liam Kerr has said, this is not being dealt with any urgency. We know we have a criminal justice system in crisis, and our view is that that is not sustainable. As has been said by many speakers in this debate, including Rona Mackay, Liam MacArthur, Maggie Chapman, Fulton McGregor, and indeed the Cabinet Secretary herself, the evidence suggests that for most crimes, non-custodial sentences are the most effective in preventing reoffending. This Parliament has received, and indeed the Scottish Government has commissioned, many reports, statements and policy documents to this effect. The Cabinet Secretary spoke about some of the negative impact in prison, and I listened to her opening contribution with interest, particularly in relation to the review, because I have to say that the Justice Team for Scottish Labour only became aware of this work when this motion was put down and only received any detail in the contribution today. And I do think there needs to be a genuine open discussion in this Parliament about these issues, and the framework of the justice system in Scotland often prevents that happening. For example, some of the policy round about sentencing of young offenders, sentencing for under 25s, was not a matter that was debated in any seriousness or consequence by this Parliament. So I agree with the Cabinet Secretary in terms of her motion, where she sees that there is an important role for Parliament to play in discussing imprisonment and the best means for addressing offending behaviour. And I would hope that in future that happens more. I agree with what she said about the approach in many Scandinavian countries and what we need to learn from international experience. However, the speech she made simply repeated what has been said in this chamber on many occasions since the creation of this Parliament. In 2008, Scotland's Choice, the report by the Scottish Prison Commission, also known as the McLeish Commission, examined Scotland's prison system, prison population and the factors that influence that. It sets a target to reduce the prison population to 5,000 people per day and to use community sentences more. It is unclear how the work being proposed here today differs from that work and indeed other pieces of work that have been commissioned, and it would be helpful if the Cabinet Secretary could respond to that in her summing up. Scottish Labour does not have significant differences to the Scottish Government's policy on the use of prison. However, it is very clear to us that there has not been the action required by the Scottish Government to implement this, and it would be useful to know why the Cabinet Secretary believes that the piece of work that she's suggesting today is going to make that shift, so we get the action that is needed. The Scottish Government's recent prison early releases led to high reoffending rates as predicted due to the failure to allow time for effective planning. As Polly McNeill said, work with offenders both within the prison system is vital for prisoners who need to be incarcerated, but also the courts need to have the confidence to use community disposals, as they will be the appropriate disposal on many occasions. And the evidence that the Criminal Justice Committee has heard on a number of occasions is that confidence simply does not exist within the judiciary and the sheriffdoms. We know that community justice budgets make up less than 5% of the total justice budget. I was pleased that there was an increase this year, but we know that this still does not provide the levels of funding that are needed to match the ambitions that the Scottish Government has set out over many decades now. We also know from responses to freedom of information requests that in many cases where community disposals are made by the courts, they are never implemented. As Polly McNeill said, Scottish Labour will give our full cooperation to any attempt to drive the use of community disposals in Scotland where they are appropriate, and in particular we will support any attempts to increase community justice budgets. We are pleased that this debate is happening today, but are concerned about the lack of focus on victims and the need for restorative justice. And indeed, I think Jamie Green is correct when he said that the word victim was not used at all in the opening statement. The Cabinet Secretary spoke about international comparisons, and of course one of the significant differences between our system and those of many of the countries that she referred to is the role of the victim. I am pleased to close this debate. As I say, I do actually believe there's a great deal of consensus in this debate, and I very much hope that we're able to focus on how we actually start delivering that consensus as a Parliament and making sure we get the changes in the criminal justice system that are actually going to make a difference to communities in Scotland.
Thank you, Ms Clark. I now call on Sharon Dowie to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate takes place in the shadow of the emergency release of prisoners, many of them dangerous criminals who are walking free after serving just 40% of their sentence. That development tells you everything you need to know about SNP priorities when it comes to justice. Their own failures, covering infrastructure, court business and a failure to rehabilitate, has led to a situation where jails are too full. It's a self-inflicted crisis which spills more dangerous offenders out onto the streets, where we know many will almost immediately re-offend if they haven't already. All the while, victims of crime are failed, left to live in fear about what their tormentors, who are supposed to be safely incarcerated, might do next. Presiding Officer, the Justice Secretary's motion begins by lamenting the fact that Scotland's prison population is the highest in Western Europe. The SNP have been in charge of the very justice system which has presided over that statistic for almost 18 years. What's more, they've also been in charge of the numerous other portfolios which can contribute to the likelihood of someone falling into a life of crime in later life, not least education, but also health and social care. So we need to be clear, especially to victims, the failings in Scotland's justice system lie squarely at the door of the Scottish Government. Presiding Officer, I'll see how much progress I make and what time I've got. Okay. Presiding Officer, I recently attended a summit on violence amongst young people, and the examples put forward by victims and their families were extremely powerful. We heard how attacks against young people by their peers were routinely not dealt with in a way that reflected the seriousness of a crime. Cases which ought to have been put through the Sheriff Courts were diverted to the Children's Reporter. The schools felt powerless to take any action, and the police would tell families they wish they could do more, but their hands were tied. The Scottish Government puts much effort into looking after the interests of young criminals, so much so they don't believe criminals under 25 should get jail time at all, even for very serious crimes with grave consequences for the victim. And we know they've made schools so powerless that violent and aggressive pupils at best simply have to be placated. At the round table, young people told us that they felt they were forgotten. They said, regardless of your age and gender, you are responsible for your actions, and actions should have consequences. So why is it that the Government puts so much effort into pandering to young criminals, but so little effort into protecting and looking after young victims? Going to members' contributions, as my colleague Liam Kerr said, it's actually quite difficult to be sent to prison these days, but it's hardly surprising when a government which repeatedly says it will not interfere with courts and sentencing introduced in 2022 an instruction that criminals under 25 will not get prison unless no other sentence is appropriate. As Jamie Green said, safer streets should be the underlying issue with any policy, and spoke of the need to clear those being held in remand, which would help clear our prisons. Liam MacArthur said every effort to rehabilitate and keep people out of prison. He mentioned that, and I totally agree with that. He also spoke of penal populism. So there are cases where the safest place for a person and the public is in a secure location, and we need to ensure that that is the case where needed. The Cabinet Secretary spoke of a review chaired by Martin Evans, which was welcomed by a number of members in the Chamber. Maggie Chapman also had asked about getting regular updates on the Commission. I know that the Cabinet Secretary said that there was an interim report in the autumn, but I was wondering if she could give us more about what updates we will get and will the updates be shared with Parliament. Pauline McNeill said that we need to run our prisons better within. We must ensure that those who want rehabilitation are given the opportunity to take courses. She also said about the answer lying in through care, which was also highlighted by Fulton McGregor and Ben McPherson. Rona Mackay and Audrey Nicholl both spoke about strengthening community justice. So criminal justice, social work do a great job. But again, the issue is that they've been underfunded for years. So I welcome the proposed increase this year, but we need to make sure that community justice, as well as the third sector, get the funding that they need and they require to be able to do the through care that's needed for those coming through prison. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government needs to spend more time focusing on the justice system so it is fit to protect Scotland's public in 2025 and beyond. We need to end automatic early release, introduce Michelle's Law to exclude dangerous criminals from the communities they used to plague, make the victim notification scheme more transparent, whole life sentences for the worst criminals, reform the ridiculous guidelines which advise against jailing the under-25s. Maybe if criminals feared the prospect of going to jail, more of them would stay out of trouble, helping to solve the SNP's jail crisis for them. Presiding Officer, victims of crime deserve so much better than this, and I support Liam Kerr's amendment.
Thank you, Ms Dowry. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Angela Constance to wind up on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 8 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I've always vowed never to be one of those politicians that only tell you what they're really thinking after they've left office. Nonetheless, I'm not going to permit other opposition politicians to put words into my mouth. But I do want to once again put on record right here, right now, what I've said before, that our prison population is too high and that we need to reduce it. And there are some people in our prisons that shouldn't be there. Now, that is not an attack on the independence of the judiciary, who deal with the facts and circumstances of individual cases, and they make decisions based on the information and options that are available to them. And Liam MacArthur touched on that. And of course, they need safe, credible, robust community justice options. And I'm very pleased that in my time as Cabinet Secretary that I've delivered not just an increase in community justice for this financial year, but also for the next financial year. Because I accept entirely that the judiciary need to have confidence in robust community disposals. I do also question, having listened to Sharon Dowie's contribution, whether that consensus that Katie Clark spoke of really does exist, because I think if she had to respond and comment on some of the press releases from others that come across my desk, I think she would have a different view. But it was my job, once upon a time, as a prison-based social worker, as a hospital social worker, to assess and respond to the risks and needs of individuals. And as Cabinet Secretary for Justice, my job is to assess and act on the risks and needs of our prison population and also our criminal justice system as a whole. And of course, we collectively have every right to use the parameters of this Parliament. But there are people in the care of our prisons that could and should would be suitable for alternatives, whether it's alternatives to remand, alternatives to custody, or indeed people who would be better cared for in hospital or a care setting. I'm going to really struggle for time, so if you don't mind, if I have time, I'll come back to Ms McNeill. But we do need to find better ways, better pathways for progression for those within our care as well. And one of the biggest changes since McLeish, because when I was a prison social worker, the prison population was 5,000. But it's not only changed in terms of numbers, it's changed in terms of complexity and vulnerability, and I just can't have that. We have 38% of the prison population with a disability, 41% with a long-term illness, 15% with mental illness, and 2/5 have experienced difficulties with drugs in the community. And this may not be a populist thing to say either, Presiding Officer, but I think irrespective of your abode, whether you live in the community or whether you're incarcerated in prison, I think you deserve the very best of medical care. And the purpose of this debate today is for us to collectively to move on from narrating the problem to be more focused on the solutions. And the purpose of the review is to take that thorough and independent look at how sentencing policy aligns with the ambitions that many of us have for a modern, proportionate and rehabilitative justice system. And it's to inform the longer-term thinking and action. It is not instead of action. And I agree entirely with Pauline McNeill's points about transparency. I am confident that the Commission will engage fully with victims, Parliament and indeed individual MSPs. I'm very pleased that Liam Kerr has unequivocally welcomed his support for the review and is committed to engage with it. And in terms of Audrey Nicholl's question, what I have asked the Commission to initially focus on is community sentencing, bail and remand and release from custody. Remand is a priority, and that's why with the new through care contract it does include men for the first time. And it is not a binary choice on whether to be a champion for victims or a prison reformer. And in the few years that I've been Cabinet Secretary for Justice, I've overseen the bail and release legislation. I sponsored the Children, Crime and Justice Bill. We are all in the midst of the Victims' Witness and Justice Reform Bill. Only yesterday we debated in committee the Criminal Justice Modernisation and Domestic Homicide and Suicide Review Bill. I've laid regulations on GPS technology. I will be coming back to committee with regulations on home detention curfew. And of course, Maggie Chapman is absolutely correct to speak to the value of the third sector. They, after all, have been pivotal in terms of the National Through Care contract. But there are also organisations in the third sector, such as the scheme and my own constituency, who do invaluable work in HMP Addiewell. And of course, today, I hope, is an opportunity to say what you are for as well as what you are against. And I think, if I've heard correctly, there are members who are in favour of the new prisons, the replacement prisons that are being built, and of course are critical of the cost of that. I understand that, because every public pound is pressure. But the reality of the facts is that the new HMP Glasgow will be almost twice the size as from the original plans that were debated, and it is the 62% increase in the price of precast concrete, for example, that is far more of an issue than a few birdie boxes and a few trees. And I am, Presiding Officer, pleased to have secured that funding to get the contract signed, and it will deliver £450 million of economic benefits. But I can say to Parliament, I don't want to be building over and above the new HMP Glasgow another £1 billion prison, because we cannot build our way out of this problem. We could and we should be building our way into safer communities. And David Gauck, when reflecting on the principles of sentencing policy, which of course are punishment, crime reduction, public protection, victims, rehabilitation and reparation, he also said that sentencing policy needs to be rooted in public sector reform. And there's many a question to be asked about the value of a prison place that costs almost £50,000 a year, and if we had the imagination and the commitment to be transformative, how that public investment could achieve better outcomes, not just to rehabilitate offenders, but also for our safer communities. And, Presiding Officer, I will end on a note about speaking your mind and saying what you think. We have heard yet again some people deride the sentencing guidelines for young people. Of course, that is a matter for the Independent Sentencing Council. The Sentencing Council is not an SNP Sentencing Council. It was approved, set up in legislation by this Parliament, and I can assure you it is independent, and I would never for a minute undermine that. But I will tell you this, Presiding Officer, after standing here in this Parliament and making commitments to deliver on the recommendations made in a fatal accident inquiry on the death of 2 young people, I will defend those young people guidelines day in, day out if I need to, because I believe, and I'm being utterly transparent here, I believe criminal justice policy should take account of age, inexperience and recognise the greater possibility of change in our young. Punishment by imprisonment will always exist, and punishment by imprisonment will always be with us. But imprisonment is about the loss of liberty and autonomy, not the loss of humanity.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the debate on independent review of sentencing and penal policy, and there will be a short pause before we move on to the next item of business. Thank you.
The next item of business is debate on motion 16526 in the name of Alistair Allen on legislative consent motion, Great British Energy Bill UK legislation. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons. And I call on Alistair Allen to speak to and move the motion. Minister, up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Parliament for giving this further opportunity to debate the Great British Energy Bill and the supplementary legislative consent memorandum lodged in Parliament on Monday. I propose that the Parliament gives consent, or seek that the Parliament gives consent to the UK Bill and to the UK Government's new clause on it on sustainable development. During the UK Government's report stage, or the Bill's report stage in the House of Lords, as recently as the 11th of February, 4 amendments were made to the UK Bill, and one of these clauses required a supplementary LCM from this Parliament. This is Clause 7A, which requires GB Energy to keep under review its impact on the achievement of sustainable development in the UK. This clause will likely touch on areas within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, such as the environment and planning. I also note that a further amendment to the bill was tabled as recently as Monday, and this would require the UK Secretary of State to appoint an independent person. I'll give way.
Daniel Johnson, briefly.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. Just on the technical point, can I just ask why the Government isn't waiting until the final reading to wrap up the LCMs into a single decision for this Parliament to take?
Minister. Well, I thank the member for that question. I think the bill is proceeding, and this is a matter for the UK Government, the bill is proceeding at great pace, and my understanding is that royal assent will be very soon, within the next few weeks, I understand. So we do have to respond quickly to what is a bill that may very quickly become a law. And I noticed that this clause, the most recent clause on Monday, the most recent amendment, is not covered by the supplementary LCM we are debating today, as this additional amendment was tabled by the UK Government too late for inclusion in this LCM, and that, Presiding Officer, is, I'm afraid, how last minute some of these changes have been at the UK Parliament end. I'm going to have to make progress in the little time I have available. It is important to note that the Scottish Government, as I say, was not given much notice of this clause, and I refer now to the clause, the amendment dealing with Clause 6A. It is important to note that the Scottish Government was given very little notice of this clause being tabled, and this was also the case with the clauses that are covered by today's supplementary LCM. Now, I noticed the NZT Committee's concerns about not having sufficient time to provide scrutiny to this LCM, and I would like to be clear that the Scottish Government recognises the importance of Parliament having sufficient time to scrutinise legislation. Indeed, we share the Committee's concerns on that point. The lack of time afforded to the Scottish Parliament to scrutinise these amendments is the result of decisions on timing taken by the UK Government due to the speed at which this bill is moving through the UK Parliament towards royal assent. I have raised these points with UK ministers and have emphasised the importance of the Scottish Parliament and its committees having sufficient time to consider these matters. I also made it clear that the amendments being made at such an extremely late stage in the UK Bill's parliamentary passage do make it extremely challenging to facilitate the Scottish Parliament's consideration of the motion on legislative consent ahead of the bill getting royal assent. I hope members will therefore appreciate that the Scottish Government shares some of the concerns that have been expressed and that those concerns have been communicated to the UK Government. Presiding Officer, on the substance of the UK Bill, I am aware that there is a considerable level of interest in how GB Energy will operate. In the last few months, in parallel to our legislative discussions, my officials and I have worked with the UK Government to establish how GB Energy can help Scotland seize the boundless opportunities of the energy transition here in Scotland. Despite already having a strong pipeline of clean energy and growing supply chain opportunities, there are still so many opportunities for Scotland to grasp as we advance our position as one of the world's leading countries in renewable energy production. So we are engaging with the UK Government, I hope constructively, I believe constructively, on funding priorities across the spectrum of Scottish clean energy interests to ensure Scottish projects benefit from GB Energy funding in 2025-26 and beyond. In discussions with the UK Government, I and the Acting Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero and Energy have been clear that GB Energy must deliver real benefits for the people of Scotland and support a just energy transition. It certainly has the potential to do that, and so, Presiding Officer, I move that the Parliament agrees that all relevant provisions of the Great British Energy Bill, introduced in the House of Commons on 25 July 2024 and subsequently amended in relation to sustainable development, Clause 7A, on the 11th February 2025, so far as these matters fall within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament and alter the executive competence of Scottish ministers, should be considered by the UK Parliament.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Edward Mountain to speak on behalf of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Mountain.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And here we go yet again, debating a legislative consent motion on the GB Energy Bill. The first legislative consent motion was lodged in August last year. It didn't set out a clear position on consent or provide much detail at all. Now, that might have been okay if the Scottish Government had followed up on its own clear undertaking to provide a substantive update by that September. But it didn't. It took until late December, following repeated requests from the committee, to get an update by way of a letter. The supplementary LCM then followed in January, setting out progress made in intergovernmental decisions to reach a common position. It came so late in the day that the committee had only time to take some quick evidence — no, not at the moment, I won't, Minister — to take out quick evidence and rush out a short report. We did our best under the circumstances, and I think the report did add usefully to the debate. But I think the committee should have been spared that white-knuckle ride. Presiding Officer, I made no apology for bringing this up again, because, to be frank, when we last debated the bill 2 weeks ago, I don't feel the Cabinet Secretary engaged with these points. They were raised in good faith by the whole committee to ensure that the process works better. Now, I turn to the second supplementary LCM, which the committee saw late on Monday night. We then had to produce a report in time for today's debate. This left us with no realistic prospect whatsoever to come to a considered position on the amendment that triggered this new memorandum, far less take any evidence. So we can express as a committee no collective informed view on consent. The concerns we raised in our earlier report bear repeating. If there are delays in information reaching the Parliament, then we end up as bystanders, not participants in the process, which we should be. And we end up where we are here today, where a committee has literally gone through the motions in order to produce a report that met the formal requirements of standing orders, but doesn't meaningfully contribute to the policy debate. Now, Presiding Officer, I said in the last debate, and I repeat it today, that the committee is all for constructive intergovernmental discussions aimed at hammering out agreement on a legislative consent. And I, of course, hope the Scottish Government can be blindsided, as the rest of us, by amendments lodged late in the day at Westminster, as we've heard. But in the present case, I do wonder aloud, especially given the dates that the Minister's given us, that the Scottish ministers knew about this from a UK government minister when the amendment would be lodged. We've been told it was over 7 days ago. When there is a 7-day gap between this and amendment being lodged and an LCM appearing. Now, with respect, the new LCM doesn't provide much analysis of the new clause and its implication for devolved competence. It mainly generally repeats the observations about supporting the broad aims of GB Energy. Getting the LCM a bit earlier would have given the committee more chance to do the job standing orders have given us to do, and we have every right to do so. Presiding Officer, I end up by urging both governments to work together to ensure this Parliament has as much time as it can so it can meaningfully scrutinise LCMs. Otherwise, the risk as the committee's role in the consent process is reduced to being an empty ritual, which as a parliamentarian and convener, I find totally unacceptable. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. I now call Douglas Lumsden. Up to 5 minutes, Mr Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And it's a pleasure to speak and talk about the motion today on my favourite topic, the myth that is GB Energy. Because GB Energy will do nothing for my constituents. It's a fraudulent front that seeks to rob hard-working oil and gas workers of a livelihood. And what's worse, it's that my constituents are expected to be grateful for the GB Energy being based in Aberdeen, grateful for new pylons covering the countryside, grateful that they were promised 1,000 jobs, only for the chair of GB Energy to row back on that commitment and tell us that it might be 200 over the next 5 years. And we were told before the election that GB Energy would reduce bills. But what we see is bills increasing. I'll give way to Daniel Johnson to tell us when bills will decrease.
Daniel Johnson.
Deputy President, I'm very grateful to the member giving way. The word fraud has a very precise meaning. Perhaps he could explain its use here. And secondly, unless he's not aware of the way legislation works, the legislation is not yet passed. GB Energy won't be able to be up and running until that legislation is passed. Maybe he wants to reconsider his language somewhat.
Douglas Lumsden.
It's fraudulent when you're promised 1,000 jobs and then the chair of GB Energy says, well, that'll come in maybe 20 years' time. That's what I call fraudulent. It's a joke. Presiding Officer, we have Labour and the SNP, two partners in crime, determined to destroy the countryside with pylons, both turning a blind eye to the desecration of the north and north east of Scotland. Labour and SNP, two partners in crime, determined to destroy the oil and gas industry, and with it, the tens of thousands of well-paid jobs. And it's common sense to not have a ban without a plan. We on this side understand that, and Unite the Union understand that. And like them, I will fight for my constituents to save the jobs of the North Sea oil workers. And it's shameful how few of the Labour MSPs have signed up to Unite's campaign. A party that meant to stand up for workers, instead siding with their donors and Just Stop Oil. Like GB Energy itself, the process that we're being asked to follow in approving this LCM is a joke. We had an LCM a couple of weeks back, and then we had a supplementary one lodged on Monday of this week. And as the convener said, given no time for the Net Zero Committee to scrutinise the impact before taking a decision today. A complete disrespect to this Parliament. And it sounds like that we may have another LCM coming maybe next week. So, Presiding Officer, what is changing from this LCM? So, from what I can gather, it adds sustainable development is being added. And if we look at the definition of sustainable development, it says sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So what about the future generations that are going to have their countryside ruined by the over-industrialisation that we're seeing? What about the future generations that are having prime agricultural land taken away and replaced by battery storage sites, substations or solar panels? Earlier this week, I met with the Angus Pylon Action Group, and I believe they have asked to speak to Gillian Martin, but those requests have fallen on deaf ears, like requests from all other campaign groups. They are devastated at what they are facing. They feel ignored and abandoned by this government, who talk about engaging with communities, but don't want to listen to them. They have real concerns, but are struggling to get answers. And this is where the Scottish Government are also to blame. In the weeks since we had this debate last time, there's still no news on the energy strategy. This is now years late. No strategy, no plan, no clue. This sums up this devolved government. And we are still working under the shadow of their presumption against new oil and gas. The presumption that we should import oil and gas rather than use our own resources. The presumption that we should protect jobs in Azerbaijan rather than Aberdeen. The presumption that we should make ourselves poorer while making the Saudis richer. We need a common-sense strategy for our energy, one that puts our own resources and our own workers at the heart of it. This government doesn't care about oil and gas, and they certainly don't care about the people working offshore or in the supply chain. Oil and gas from North Sea is good for Britain, good for Scotland, good for the environment and good for jobs. Let's drop the pretence that GB Energy will bring down bills or be good for investment or, Presiding Officer, be good for my constituents, because it simply won't be. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Sarah Boyack up to 4 minutes. Ms Boyack.
Members will remember that in the debate we had 2 weeks ago, when we passed the LCM on the GB Energy Bill, it was flagged that there would be subsequent amendments which would require us to approve them in the Scottish Parliament. I think this is an important amendment today because it states that GB Energy must keep under review the impact of its activities and the achievement of sustainable development in the United Kingdom. And it is a crucial amendment because it ensures that we have more joined-up thinking, which some of us have called for a long time. For example, in my upcoming Wellbeing and Sustainable Development Bill. Many of the Sustainable Development Goals which need to be addressed fall under the remit of the Scottish Government. So our Parliament needs to debate this issue and give its consent should it pass. And Scottish Labour will support this LCM tonight. GB Energy will incentivise new and emerging technologies such as marine renewables, floating offshore wind, so that we can maximise the new job opportunities and get the range of new clean energy and heat supplies we urgently need to support the supply chains and investment in green manufacturing. And in my last speech on this issue, I focused on the need for a much more joined-up approach between the new government in the UK, the Scottish Government and our councils. But we also need to focus on decent job opportunities. So, financial support for offshore wind developers so that they give investment in their areas, including traditional oil and gas communities, is part of the Clean Industry Bonus deal. And as Ed Miliband said, this is our clean energy superpower mission, kick-starting growth, delivering energy security and transforming towns and cities as part of this transition from the ports of Nigg and Leith to the manufacturing hubs of Blyth and Hull. So we need to be part of that process and we need a just and a fair transition. And if we're going to get sustained, inclusive, sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, decent work for all, the building of resilient infrastructure, the promotion of inclusive and sustainable industrialisation, then we need to see the work of GB Energy delivering in practice. And as I raised to the First Minister this week, there's also the work of the Scottish Government sitting alongside that, with the long-awaited energy strategy and just transition plan. Briefly.
Graham Simpson, briefly.
The intervention. Does Sarah Boyack think that this Parliament has had sufficient time to consider this LCM?
Sarah Boyack.
Well, the irony is it's actually a very straightforward amendment that we are debating tonight, because we've debated sustainable development on numerous occasions in this Parliament. The point is actually about the end of the stage of a bill, and we have the same issue in the Scottish Parliament when we go from stage 2 to stage 3, when suddenly key actors see events coming up in stage 3. So yes, the point that was made by the convener of the Net Zero Committee is well made, that was made last time. But we've got to debate the issue now. We need decisive, rapid climate action It's more urgent than ever. And we cannot just have another negative debate promoted by the Tories. We've got to make sure that we are engaged in this process. We take it seriously because the climate emergency is going to impact on our economy on a more regular basis. The example of the last Friday in January, when Scotland pretty much shut down, is a good example of the negative impact of the climate emergency. While the Labour government at the UK level is serious about delivering for Scotland and our planet, and the SNP government now reluctantly admit it, the Tories are determined to drag us away from progress. It's desperate politics. Our constituents and our communities need more grown-up politics. And over no, I certainly won't. I'm winding up. Our UK Labour government has taken more climate action in 6 months than the Tories did in 14 years of government. That says it all.
Thank you. I now call Willie Rennie. Up to 4 minutes, please.
It's very Edward Mountain that he considers a legislative consent motion based on an amendment in the House of Lords on the GB energy bill to be a white knuckle ride. That's the kind of rock and roll life that he lives. But he does make a valid point that the process, the legislative process, this place gets a lot of things wrong. But the one thing that I think it does pretty well is the legislative process. It does take a long time for consultation, for pre-stage 1 reports, for a long period for stage 2 amendments, and then in here for stage 3, and as long as it takes. Whereas I've experienced the Westminster system, and it is, to be fair, a white knuckle ride. It is rushed. It doesn't take enough time to consider all the consequences. And I think that's what we're feeling today, to be fair to the Minister. And that's where I hope, in the long run, we do get changes in the House of Lords and the House of Commons in its legislative process. But one of the amendments that was achieved in the House of Lords that's not affecting this LCM was one by one of our members of the House of Lords who secured an amendment on community energy, which we think is incredibly important, and it will now mean that GB Energy is required to collaborate with local communities on boosting local economies, on jobs and investment for community energy projects, which we think is a good thing. We'll support the LCM today because actually I think in broad terms GB Energy could be a good thing. It's led by Jürgen Meyer, who is quite a dynamic force. He was CEO at Siemens before. He knows the territory. I think he'll make a difference, and I think we should support things that make a difference. I want to return to the points that I made in the previous debate 2 weeks ago about the use of community benefit funds and also licensing revenues. There are several questions I think we need to consider. One is, how much do we require from the companies? And my colleague Angus MacDonald wants to increase the £5,000 per megawatt installed capacity at a higher level. And I think he's got a case there. We need to make sure that it's not too much that it discourages development. But nevertheless, I think there is capacity to increase. There is who do we do it with? Is it community equity, community ownership? Or is it giving it to local authorities or other vehicles for delivery? And I think, with Tom Arthur's statement earlier on this week, I think there is an opportunity around community well-being that we should be exploring in more detail. But the area that I think is requiring a much more substantial change is, what do we use it for? And there are a lot of communities that have benefited significantly from community facilities like AstroTurf pitches and village halls and the likes, which is a good thing and it requires to be invested in. But there's only so many AstroTurf pitches that you can actually build in certain communities. And there is a real crying need for an improvement in infrastructure, in roads, in housing within certain communities, particularly in the Highlands and the Islands, where we'll be installing not just wind turbines but also pump storage facilities that will put quite a lot of pressure on the local road network, but also on demand for housing. And I think we should be looking for using some of those revenues and funds for investment in local communities to make sure there is a lasting legacy for them, that it makes sure it outlasts even the projects themselves, so that they can see longer-term benefits for their areas. So we'll be supporting the LCM today, but I hope the Minister takes on board the wider benefits and arguments around about community benefit.
Thank you. I now call on Jackie Dunbar. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The untapped resources of the North Sea are as nothing compared to the untapped resources of our people.
53 years after Jimmy Reid uttered that line as part of a speech titled Alienation, those words still hold true, as does so much else of that speech. Today, folk are feeling alienated. Many feel themselves to be victims of economic forces beyond their control. They are feeling frustration, hopelessness and despair. 8 months ago, many of those people voted for change. They voted for their energy bills to be £300 lower. They voted for Scotland to be the powerhouse of a clean energy mission. They voted for GB Energy based in Scotland that would see 1,000 new jobs created. So where are we now? My constituents' bills aren't £300 lower, they're £279 higher. And some are double that amount out of pocket after Labour took away their winter fuel payment. We've seen funding for the Acorn project, a project that would move a just transition on leaps and bounds, put on pause. When the Labour UK government did announce £22 billion for carbon capture, Scotland didn't even get a mention. And at Grangemouth, where Labour pledged to save the refinery and to save the jobs there, those workers have been betrayed by the UK government, while Scottish Labour have been shamefully silent. Meanwhile, in my Donside constituency, we finally got the news that GB Energy was going to be based in Aberdeen, which I think was always the obvious choice, and I welcomed it. And then the news got taken back because, of course, Labour conference was just around the corner, so any investment got put on pause until after this could be re-announced. Then a month later, a chair was announced for Aberdeen-based GB Energy, and he was going to be based in Manchester. And those 1,000 jobs we were promised, apparently those are still coming. We just need to wait for 20 years. It's no wonder folk feel betrayed and feel alienated. Don't get me wrong, I welcome any investment in a just transition. I welcome any investment in clean and green energy. I welcome any new jobs coming to Aberdeen. I welcome and support those things because they will benefit the folk I represent. And I will be supporting this bill motion today, but I really wish I was welcoming more. North Sea oil has given Scotland, and the North East in particular, a lot of advantages, the biggest of which is that the North East now has a workforce that is world-leading in so many ways. Some of those folk were born and raised in Aberdeen and have spent their whole careers here. Some learnt their skills here, travelled the world, gaining experience and came back. And some moved to Aberdeen because of the industry and have put down roots here. Wherever they are from, they are some of the best in the world, and we are lucky to have them in Aberdeen. But if we want to keep them here, if we want their help in delivering a just transition, in guaranteeing our energy security, in making our energy supply cleaner, greener and cheaper, then we need to invest properly in the North East and give those workers a reason to build their futures in Scotland while they build Scotland's future. And if the UK government won't go far enough and fast enough, then let Scotland deliver it herself. We have the energy. We just need the power.
Yeah, well done.
We now move to wind-up speeches. I call first Daniel Johnson. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think it's somewhat ironic holding a debate on energy at this point on a Thursday afternoon. So let me try that witticism to begin with. Look, in some ways, leading off from where Jackie Dunbar's comments there, she's absolutely right to articulate that frustration and also the absolute burning imperative that we have in front of us. We have to make this energy transition work. Although I would say that there's somewhat of an irony about the frustrations about what GB Energy should be delivering, and we've not yet passed the legislation. So there is a sense in which that is what we are here to do to get this through. And notwithstanding, I think, the frustrations of the legislative process, but let's focus on what this is to do, and we do need GB Energy to be up and running. But let me deal head-on, I think, some of the assertions and frankly, slightly wild accusations from Douglas Lumsden. Because let's be clear, he treats this issue as though it's binary, that we have an option. It's either oil and gas or renewables. That is a false choice. Whether we like it or not, we need a transition, because whether you listen to the North Sea Transition Authority or you listen to the Wood Group, over 90% of the extractable resource of the North Sea has been extracted. Peak oil was in 1999. We need to transition our North Sea energy sector, whether or not there was the imperative of net zero or not. So when you talk to the oil and gas sector, and I do, they do not say whether or not we should be having GB Energy. They want to be getting on with it because they recognise the need to transition. Happy to give way.
Douglas Lumsden, briefly.
I absolutely accept there's a need for transition, but there needs to be a plan in place. I've signed the Unite the Union no ban without a plan. I think Jackie Dunbar has also. Has Daniel Johnson signed it?
Daniel Johnson.
But what does he think GB Energy is about? It is central to the plan. If he wants a plan, he should be backing GB Energy. For goodness sake, you cannot on the one hand say we need a plan and then oppose GB Energy. Don't be ridiculous. Seriously. Because the reality is we need this, and we need GB Energy because for two critical reasons. The transition has to happen at a pace that if there was not state intervention could not happen. Secondly, it will rely on innovation, technology and engineering that we do not have in place. Unless we de-risk this process, de-risk the investment, this transition will not happen, and we will squander the legacy of the North Sea. Because when you talk to the industry, one thing is abundantly clear. What the North Sea and the legacy of the North Sea gives us is the ability to do engineering offshore, at sea, in the harshest of conditions, which we need to do if we are going to reap the benefits of the energy transition. Very happy to give way.
Kevin Stewart, briefly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and we do need to reap the benefits and we need to keep that workforce. I recognise what Mr Johnson has said about the legislation not being passed, but already we have seen pledges being rolled back on. That is of deep concern to the people of Aberdeen, to the North East and elsewhere. Could I ask Mr Johnson to use his good office to talk to his colleagues in London and actually get them to tell us exactly what all of this means?
Thank you. Daniel Johnson.
London, Deputy Presiding Officer. I talk to them here because they're up here regularly. I was talking to Michael Shanks just this morning. I will be talking to colleagues over the weekend. I talk to Ian Murray on a regular basis. Believe you me, we want to get this done. Our UK colleagues want to get this done. If people want to see a plan, let's get on with getting GB Energy. And I understand the frustrations. We live in difficult times. We want to see as much investment flowing through GB Energy as possible, and if that is tempered, it is tempered by the appalling legacy this government has been left by the Tories across the way in this chamber. That is the reality. So I understand the frustrations of the legislative process, but let's be clear. Let's get on with the transition. Let's get on with backing GB Energy. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call Graham Simpson. Up to 4 minutes, please, Mr Simpson.
Many thanks, Presiding Officer. I, like Edward Mountain, take the work of this Parliament very seriously, and I like things to be done properly, whatever the outcome. The consideration of this LCM before us today is an example of how not to do things properly. Now, the convener of the Net Zero Committee, certainly.
Murdo Fraser, briefly.
Mr Simpson for taking an intervention. I agree with him on the question of parliamentary scrutiny. In that respect, does he share my concern that not a single member of the Green Party has contributed to this debate? None are in the chamber this afternoon. It's almost as if they don't care about the issue of green energy. Does he share my concern on that issue?
Graham Simpson.
Yes, I certainly do. It is rather bizarre. But I agree with the convener of the Net Zero Committee. He set out things very clearly. You cannot expect a committee to do its work properly with so little time for detailed scrutiny. Committees of this Parliament are not rubber stamping bodies. So when that committee says in its hastily written report on this LCM that the agreement of this short report amounts to an almost literal case of a committee going through the motions, it is correct. This is treating this Parliament with contempt, something I thought this government was against. If this had been a Conservative government bill, the reaction would have been howls of derision. How times change. Now, I've listened with interest to members, not least to Douglas Lumsden, who went off on one of his regular tirades, for good reason, of course. But if we cut through the amusing froth of Mr Lumsden's strident contribution, he makes a very good point indeed, namely that GB Energy is a myth, a sham. And members, including Jackie Dunbar, in an excellent speech, have spoken about how Aberdeen and the North East were promised one thing but they are to get quite another. Labour told us they would cut our energy bills. The reverse is happening, and Ed Miliband's net zero obsession is more likely to increase costs. None of us, least of all the Labour members, can truly say we're any clearer on what GB Energy is for or what it will do. And Daniel Johnson obviously didn't get an answer to that when he spoke to Michael Shanks earlier. There is no evidence that it will drive down costs and bills. For that, you need a plan to do so, and there isn't one. That's not to say the state or local or regional authorities can't do that. They can. There are examples elsewhere in the world of that happening, but it won't happen here, and we all know it. What is before us is not the whole bill. It is just one clause, 7A. It says that Great British Energy must keep under review the impact of its activities on the achievement of sustainable development in the United Kingdom. Now, sustainable development could mean whatever you want it to mean. It's a very woolly language to use, indeed, in a bill, I think. It was lodged by Energy Minister Lord Hunt of Kings Heath, who really should have known better. He said, "We see sustainable development as a broad category." A broad category. Well, you can say that again. The vagueness of this clause is so close to meaningless that it pushes me to say it should not be in legislation. It might be harmful, it might not. It depends how you interpret it, and that's not good enough. But the main reason for rejecting this LCM is the lack of time to properly scrutinise it, so I call on Parliament to actually back itself and reject this LCM.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. And I call on Alistair Allen to wind up to 5 minutes, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank all the members who have contributed so usefully to today's debate, as well as to Mr Lumsden. And I recommend that the Parliament votes to give consent to all clauses within the bill, including the new clause 7A. Now, I am, as I said earlier, very disappointed with the length of time that we as a Parliament have been given to consider these new amendments by the UK Government. I believe, nonetheless, that it is important that we look at ways to ensure that the opportunities that GB Energy can provide to Scotland are realised. And I believe that the agreement to give consent to this LCM will help support this effort. Now, I hear loud and clear the concerns that have been expressed about process and timings today from Mr Rennie and others, and as I say, I would share many of those concerns. I do want to reiterate to the UK Government the importance of our parliamentary process and the need to give the Scottish Parliament sufficient time to scrutinise legislation, including late-stage amendments. Given the fact that the bill requires the consent of this Parliament, it is crucial that members are given sufficient time to consider proposed changes. This process has, at points, of course, not met that test, and that is a point which I have made to the UK Government. To pick up on Daniel Johnson's point about his very sensible question about why we couldn't have waited until later in the UK Bill's progress to deal with an LCM, I should perhaps clarify that LCMs have to be tabled within 14 days of a Government amendment being taken, which I hope explains our reasoning on this. On Edward Mountain's point about what has been happening since last summer on these issues, I make no apology at all for seeking assurances from the UK Government that would ensure that the interests of this Parliament were assured during in devolved areas when the bill became law. By way of conclusion, Presiding Officer, despite the concerns that have rightly been expressed by a number of members, and indeed the justified scepticism from Jackie Dunbar about the Labour Government's election commitments, I do think that it is sensible for us to continue to work with partners, including GB Energy, the UK Government and our public bodies, to continue to grow the community energy sector. If I have time briefly.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank the Minister for giving way. And the Cabinet Secretary said the other week that there had been good conversations with the UK Government. Can the Minister assure us that he and the Cabinet Secretary will express the ire of this Parliament in the fact that we are dealing with this very late and that there is not enough time for scrutiny. At the very least, UK ministers need to take into consideration the views of this Parliament on devolved issues. And I think that is part of the problem that was expressed by Mr Mountain earlier.
Minister.
Yes, I can confirm that I have already done that and will seek to do so again. We will continue to work with partners, as I say, to continue to grow the community energy sector, clean energy and supply chain opportunities. We look forward to further engagement to support these important priorities, which are vital for Scotland's economic growth and net zero ambitions. Presiding Officer, I move that the Parliament backs the motion granting legislative consent to all clauses within the UK Bill, including Clause 7A.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on legislative consent motion Great British Energy Bill UK legislation. It's now time to move to the next item of business, and there are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. And can I remind members that if the amendment in the name of Liam Kerr is agreed to, the amendment in the name of Pauline McNeill will fall. And the first question is that Amendment 16532.1 in the name of Liam Kerr, which seeks to amend Motion 16532 in the name of Angela Constance on independent review of sentencing and penal policy, be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. There will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system.